and force capabilities. So what does that mean? Basically, it means that we are focused on improving soldier performance across the soldier life cycle, and we use applied personnel psychology methods to do that, which includes selection, assessment, training. Sometimes we get into recruitment, and we get into leader development. So all of those things that help improve human performance, as psychologists, we're involved with. So something that a lot of people aren't familiar with is that the Army has actually been an innovator for over a century in testing and assessment. And this is the first innovation. I know it looks pretty archaic, and if you can actually get up and read some of the items are actually pretty hilarious. But this was actually a huge innovation in testing. At the time in World War I, essentially the way that testing was handled was that you had one psychologist administer a 3-hour test to one individual. That individual was usually a child, and it was to determine that they had developmental disabilities. So here comes World War I. We want a smarter Army. We want to make sure that we can handle everyone who's coming into the draft. And there are 12 million soldiers that we have to assess. Clearly you can't do that one-on-one at 3 hours a pop. So this is the first instance of standardized testing for cognitive ability. And what you can see here is, if you look over on the far side, there was a written test, which was called the Army Alpha Test. And then if you look down at the lower corner, you have a nonverbal test of cognitive ability, because much of the population at the time was illiterate. So that was the first major innovation in Army testing. But then along came World War II, and we were still trying to figure out what cognitive ability scores meant. And so we basically developed the Army General Classification Test, which was the precursor to ASVAB. And that's when you first started to see the 5-category scheme of Cat 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And basically that was used to interpret cognitive ability scores for classification and enlistment purposes. We were also trying to figure out how to better match people according to their MOS. And so this is when you first started to see a lot of the specialized aptitude tests and ability tests. So for example, we had one for mechanical aptitude, we had one for automotive, and we had one for clerical, and then a whole host of other tests. So then we continued to study cognitive ability for the next 40 years after that, because it's very important to be smart and it's very important to have job knowledge. So here's some of the things that we did. There was the AFQT. Then we had language proficiency exams and Army Foreign Language Aptitude Battery. Special Forces came along, so we needed to know how to select Special Forces. We also needed something for flight aptitude. And then finally we end with ASVAB, which we did with the other services, and then computer adaptive testing with the Navy. But the full story of performance is not cognitive ability. Cognitive ability tests are in fact one of the best predictors of job performance. If you could only have one, that is the one to have. And it's great at predicting how well soldiers do in training. And it's not very good at telling how motivated a soldier is, if they will attrit, if they're going to have conduct issues. And another big downside of cognitive ability testing is that it is notoriously associated with adverse impact. And the problem with that is that if you are discriminating against minorities, but that doesn't compare to how they perform, you're really not doing the best that you can in prediction. You're not having a diverse Army. And so there are ways to compensate for that. So we started getting into the issue of personality tests and non-cognitive predictors of performance, because personality will tell you something different than what cognitive ability does about a person. It adds incremental prediction in terms of job performance, and it can also help mitigate or offset the adverse impact of cognitive ability tests, so that you essentially get the best of both worlds. You get less adverse impact, and you can do better at statistically predicting how well someone will perform on the job. So the 1980s showed us to start working in looking at non-cognitive measures, And the first thing that we started doing was a project called Project A, which not only looked at reaffirming the validity of the ASVAB, which is a cognitive ability predictor essentially, but it also expanded the way that we looked at job performance. So rather than just looking at job performance in terms of proficiency, we started to think about performance in terms of the can-do of performance as well as the motivation or the will-do of performance. And so we had a better picture of what job performance looked like. And we also were able to gather evidence that showed that personality did predict a little bit in terms of job performance, so that we had something additional to cognitive ability to get a better idea of who would perform well. So the good news is that personality tests and cognitive ability tests are not very highly related to each other. They show a different part of the person. And so we're actually getting a much better picture of who that person is. The bad news is that personality tests, they're very easy to fake. If you've ever taken a self-report personality test, it's pretty easy to see which answer is a good answer. For example, I like to help kittens. Everybody knows that's probably a good answer to have. So we had to start to look at ways that we could make the personality test less fakeable. And so when you start to get into the 2000s, we started looking at new ways of doing personality testing. And it wasn't just that we had a personality test on a computer. That wasn't the innovation. We actually started to innovate in terms of the psychometric theory and how you score the personality test so that you could tailor a test to the individual and help reduce the likelihood that they would pick the socially desirable answer. So one of our computer adaptive personality tests is known as the Tailored Adaptive Personality Assessment System, and this is a sample item from the test. And basically, it will pose two equally desirable behaviors or two equally undesirable behaviors to an individual that will basically give them a choice. Do you think that you're more like a born leader, or do you think you can adapt to a new environment pretty easily? And these two items measure different personality constructs. The really interesting thing about the TAPAS is that each test is unique to every individual, because essentially it starts off with some seed items and it begins to drill down into triangulating on different aspects of the individual's personality. And it does this through an innovation in testing theory called item response theory. So the good news about the TAPAS and other non-cognitive measures that ARI has developed is that they've been shown to predict performance, but also to predict attrition above and beyond what your standard cognitive ability tests do, so that we have a better picture of the individual. So now we get to today. So what are we doing today and what will we be doing tomorrow? So we're going to continue to look at how we can better assess the whole person and get a picture of the whole individual. So we still want to continue to look at cognitive ability, we still want to look at personality, but we also want to start integrating character and physical data so that we have a much better picture of how the person is going to perform the job in the future. We're also going to continue to do assessments for emerging specialty areas. For example, right now we're doing assessment in cyber and FA59 strategists. And as new areas pop up, we will continue to work on developing new specialty tests for those new emerging areas. Some of the more exciting and different research that we're doing right now is we're starting to look at incorporating some big data methodology into our research. Right now we're starting with looking at performance as well as attrition because there's the most data in those areas, so we want to mine that area first. But in time, we're going to also start to model career progression over the course of a career so that we can start to get a sense of the individual's trajectory and look at that in relation to optimizing performance in the Army as a whole. So those are some of the areas there. And then with regard to team assignment, as we start to get better in understanding the individuals and understanding how individuals move over time and space, we can also start to look at how do we optimally assign individuals to teams, not just so that the individual performs well right now, because right now we're mostly focused on getting the right person to the right job. But how could you get to the person to the right job within the right social context? How can you make the team get the best performance? And that's an area that we've started to explore and will continue to explore until about 2030 is when we think we'll have solved that problem. And then if we could go all the way full circle, in World War I we asked, how do we standardize tests to identify soldiers with high potential for performance? By 2060, we need to get to the place to where we can identify potential without using tests at all. So that's my goal over the next 40 years to try to figure out how to solve that problem. So if you want to take a chance, our display's right over there. We're here for the remainder of the day. We have a great team of researchers. I'd love you guys to talk to them. And I can also answer any questions for you if you have any. Or I have answered all questions.
Theories? Do you have any theories about how you could identify potential without the standardized test?
Yeah. The question was, do I have any theories about how we could identify potential without standardized tests? One of the better ways to be able to do that is if we have baseline behavioral data. So with standardized tests, cognitive ability is the best predictor of performance. But barring not having tests, a really good predictor of future performance is current performance. So if we can get into data sources that have existing forms of behavior, and we know what that behavior means, I think that's the point where we'll start to be able to move away from traditional testing with items.
Would that be based on social media activity, or how would you gather that data?
The question was, would that be based on social media activity, or how will we gather the data? Which is a very interesting question, because social media is a very rich source of data. When I think about questions like that though, and this is something I probably should have mentioned, especially as we get into the big data realm, there's the ethical piece of it. So just because we could do it, is it the right thing? See, we represent the government, so is it right for us to delve into social media to try to figure out who, example, we should recruit, how we assess, what kind of scores we keep on people over the course of their lifetime? So I think that social media, part of the answer is I think social media is an interesting source of data. I don't know that it is ethically the correct approach to take.
So how would you build a database?
How would I build a database? I think that the first thing that we would need to do before we even got to the point of building a database is to first identify the metrics in the data that we want to look at. And then would we even have a traditional database in that respect? Right now we look at things in terms of rows and columns. I don't know if that's the case in the future. Any more questions? Okay.